In this video, we'll explore Sartre's views on the problem of solipsism. We'll look at how other philosophers influential to Sartre have tackled this issue, and then we'll explore Sartre's unique solution, his renowned analysis of the gaze, a concept that has since played a prominent role in the fields of philosophy, psychoanalysis, and critical theory, with Sartre playing a significant role in initiating this trend. Perhaps the quintessential issue in modern philosophy might be the problem of other minds. It can be described as follows. I have direct access to my own mind, and I can perceive my thoughts and feelings. Therefore, I'm certain of my mind's existence. However, the question arises when considering whether anything perceived within my mind, which I experience internally, also exists independently of me, and the issue becomes more complex when considering the minds of others. While I can have some empirical encounter with another person's body, I lack empirical evidence for their mind or consciousness. My understanding of it is purely based on inference from their visible activities and analogy with my own mental experience. This viewpoint is termed solipsism. Now, why is solipsism considered a modern philosophical problem rather than a problem encompassing all of philosophy? This change arises from a shift in the locus of truth. For much of philosophy, the truth was located outside the self, guaranteed by some transcendent being or principle. However, this locus has now shifted towards the self, with Descartes being one of the figureheads of this transformation. It's at this juncture that my knowledge and the source of truth, along with its justification, converge in the same place, myself. It's within this philosophical context that Sartre brings up the issue of shame. He sees it as a unique form of consciousness that doesn't originate from our solitary minds. Instead, it presupposes and requires the presence of another person for us to feel it. An act doesn't seem vulgar, and we don't realize its vulgarity until someone else sees us doing it. Their gaze triggers a newfound awareness and a deep sense of shame. Here, the other becomes a crucial mediator between myself and my self-perceptions. I feel shame about how I appear to the other. Sartre suggests this indicates another aspect of our existence, one that has not been yet accounted for in the relationship between being for itself and being in itself, and is what he calls here our being for others. Sartre guides us through various previous attempted solutions to the problem of solipsism, starting with realism. In Sartre's view, realism emphasizes the external physical world as our main way of interacting. However, this viewpoint oversimplifies the existence of others by reducing them to objects. Here, physical bodies are seen as the means through which we infer the knowledge of another's consciousness from their behaviors and expressions. This approach, however, overlooks the immediacy of others within our own consciousness. Returning to shame, for instance, it's not a reaction to an external reality that's objectively observed. Rather, it represents another consciousness intruding into our own, a process that occurs without any kind of inference being made. Idealism marks a second attempt to address solipsism, with Kant being the primary representative of this position for Sartre. And this position considers the means by which we come to represent others to ourselves within our consciousness, a condition of possibility for experience and understanding others as a specific kind of object within our experience. It's through the category of causality, for instance, that we can derive a necessary and certain connection between the activity of the other and their mental states. However, the other that is referred to as a system of representations remains elusive because the other is not merely a mental concept used to organize diverse phenomena. Instead, the other exceeds the limits of our knowledge and thus always exceeds the unity of our experiences of them. And so the problem with both the realist and idealist approaches is that they begin with the presupposition that the other is defined by an external negation, that the other is the self that is not me. It's a spatial difference, with realism attributing this difference to the physical separation of bodies, and idealism to the separation of consciousnesses within one's own system of representations. Both assume that one's relationship with the other can be characterized by an indifferent exteriority, wherein the other is only known to us as an object of knowledge and not as a being that directly affects us. Sartre discusses the attempts of Husserl, Hegel, and Heidegger to understand the other. While each made some positive contributions, Sartre believes they ultimately fail to fully address the problem of solipsism. Husserl seeks to surmount solipsism by stressing that the other's presence is the indispensable condition for the constitution of a world. This presence is not merely a specific empirical one, but a persistent condition and constitutive layer that provides a real guarantee of an object's objectivity. In simpler terms, an object can only be an object for me if I perceive it in the same manner as others do. However, Sartre critiques Husserl's approach as too similar to Kant's, particularly in his preservation of the transcendental subject as distinct from the empirical ego. This perspective leads us to regard the other as a category and as a necessary condition for our world experience, but not as a concrete real being. Furthermore, Husserl's conception of our understanding of the other's existence is constrained by our knowledge of the other, neglecting the other's self-knowledge, which, though inescapable from us, still impacts us. As a result, the other, as we experience it, appears as a mere absence or empty noema. The reality of the other becomes reduced to the intentions of a constituting subject. Hegel's theory suggests that the existence of the other is not only essential for the constitution of the world, as it is for Husserl, but also for the existence of one's very consciousness as a self-consciousness. This is because self-consciousness necessitates recognition from and by others. Such recognition is mutual and reciprocal, with each consciousness asserting its individuality in opposition to the other. Sartre alludes here to the master-slave dialectic, in which the master's self-certainty is incomplete without the slave's recognition, who represents the truth of the master. Thus, we observe a dialectical relationship and fundamental interdependence between self and other, which more effectively surpasses the limitations of solipsism than Husserl's approach. While Hegel argues against solipsism, Sartre believes that Hegel's resolution of self-consciousness remains still an empty formula. According to Sartre, Hegel ties it to knowledge as the measure of being, neglecting to fully explore our being for others that is irreducible to being as object. The conflict between master and slave for Sartre isn't just about recognizing an abstract truth, but about acknowledging each individual's concrete existence. The individual demands recognition of their unique existence within the universal framework, and that the particular here is fundamental to the universal. However, Sartre argues that Hegel inverses this, prioritizing the universal over the particular, and is overly optimistic in two respects. First, Hegel's epistemological optimism is evident in his claim that the truth of self-consciousness can be objectively realized through mutual recognition, leading to universal self-consciousness. Sartre disagrees with this, arguing that such universalization is impossible because there can be no common measure between how individuals perceive themselves and each other. This gap simply cannot be bridged. He maintains that even if the slave is the truth of the master, this kind of recognition fails to account for the complex particularity of individual life that's at stake here. Secondly, Sartre accuses Hegel of ontological optimism for supposedly overlooking the real issue of the relationship between his own consciousness and that of the other. Instead, Hegel assumes the truth of the whole and individual consciousness from the perspective of the absolute. And Sartre seems to believe that the plurality and separation of consciousnesses cannot be reconciled in the way that supposedly Hegel is arguing here, asserting that it is an ontological separation that inherently resists synthesis. And we can get into here about whether Hegel is a philosopher of synthesis and how Sartre might be misreading this, but I think that's missing the point as it's leading us into what is Sartre's legitimately interesting contribution here. So refusing solipsism isn't about relating one type of knowledge, self, to another, other, or collapsing knowledge with being, as Sartre believes Hegel is guilty of. Instead, it's about understanding the relationship of one being to another being. Fittingly, Sartre then refers to Heidegger, where the relationship between self and other isn't primarily about knowledge, but about a being with others, as an intrinsic feature of our being in the world. There are two ways of being with. Mostly we find ourselves in the inauthentic mode, where we conform to others within a social unity of the they. The authentic mode, on the other hand, involves taking responsibility for our own existence and our relationship with others through a resolute anticipation of our individual deaths. And elsewhere in Being and Time, Heidegger will also talk about assuming responsibility for the other to assume their own responsibility toward their authenticity. However, Sartre also finds fault with Heidegger's concept of being with, questioning the claim for a coexistence as the fundamental type of relation with others, as well as questioning how it is that we can transition from the ontological understanding of our being with others in the world, understood in the authentic mode, to the ontic understanding of everyday personal concrete relationships. So Sartre is led to conclude that, like the other thinkers mentioned, Heidegger's thought remains abstract, failing to adequately explain concrete instances of being with specific others, and failing to account for the particularity entailed in the self and other. Furthermore, the ontological being with as a structure of one's being isolates the individual, much in the same way as solipsistic claims do, because this position does not allow for a genuine connection with another human reality that arises independently from my own. Unlike Husserl, Hegel, and Heidegger, Sartre presents a phenomenological and ontological exploration of how the other is inherent in my concrete being. This leads to the most well-known part of Being and Nothingness, and perhaps Sartre's most significant philosophical contribution, his analysis of the phenomena known as the look, or the gaze. The French word is le regard, and regarder in French is distinct from another word, voir, which translates to see or to look. And while voir is a passive verb referring to the ability to perceive things with the eyes, often unintentionally, regarder is an active verb that implies intentional looking. And for this reason, I believe that the gaze more accurately conveys this meaning than the look, although the look is the translation of le regard that's being used in the book that I'm using for this series of videos. But I will call it the gaze nonetheless going forward. The central argument here is about the contrasting ways we encounter the other as a subject versus as an object. The other as subject is not so much a tangible part of our experience, but a shaping force that influences our sense of existence without revealing itself. This interaction brings unique relational and spatial dynamics into play, which significantly restructure and changes our perceptions of our surroundings and ourselves. More specifically, the other leads to a fragmentation and decentralization of our perspective, causing a shift from a self-centered universe to a reality that's now defined by the other. In this context, the other takes away our sense of control. At the same time, the other marks a fundamental gap, or as he calls it, drain hole in my world, resulting in a transformation of my universe that I can recognize as never being fully integrated into my own experience. In this sense, the other is like a black hole that cannot be directly observed, but whose gravitational force has observable effects on the planetary bodies that surround it. A profoundly important element of this encounter is that the other as subject is realized only through the revelation of myself as an object for the other. In other words, the only way I apprehend the otherness of the other, their subjectivity, which always evades my perception, is in the impact they have on me by making me the object of their unseen and unseeable perception. This being seen by the other introduces a distinct vulnerability and awareness of my physical and spatial existence. Sartre emphasizes that the gaze of the other should not be reduced to a physical pair of eyes that may or may not be observing me. It's not about a direct visual cue, but rather subtle indications like the rustling of branches or the movement of a curtain. Physical signs may be misleading. For instance, I might believe I'm being watched when in fact I'm not. However, the feeling of being observed is undeniable, regardless of the presence of actual eyes. And Foucault's analysis of the panopticon in Discipline and Punish underscores this. The effectiveness of the tower does not depend on someone physically being in it. The panopticon, true to its name, communicates a pervasive sense of being watched by the other that prisoners cannot escape from, regardless if anyone is or is not in the tower itself. And Sartre uses the example now of someone peeping through a keyhole to illustrate how self-awareness can shift through the gaze. Initially, the person is completely absorbed in the act, unaware of themselves, fully engrossed in what they're doing. But when they realize they're being watched, their consciousness suddenly shifts, and they become intensely aware of themselves from the viewpoint of the observer. This isn't a reflective self-consciousness, but an immediate sense of being the object in a world that's defined by the observer's gaze. The presence of the observer makes the person acknowledge their existence as something that can be seen and judged from an external perspective. And this leads to a significant change in how I, for example, would experience myself, transitioning from being a subject to becoming an object for another. This shift initially manifests not as a kind of cognitive knowing, but through an emotional experience, in particular shame. This allows me to experience the reality of being seen by the other rather than merely knowing it. Shame is the fundamental recognition of oneself as an object in the eyes of another. I become a self defined and limited by the other's freedom, and their gaze externalizes and solidifies my possibilities, turning them into something that can be surpassed by the other's possibilities. What does he mean by this? Well, Sartre uses the example of my potential to hide in a dark corner that now becomes the other's potential to illuminate that corner with a flashlight. So consequently, one becomes aware of a form of slavery to the other's freedom. For this reason, Sartre will say, the original fall is the existence of the other. This feeling of falling and being exposed to the other's gaze is compared to the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve realizing their nakedness after original sin, symbolizing the loss of innocence and the onset of a certain kind of self-consciousness. And furthermore, our possibilities in becoming these objects are now transformed into what Sartre calls external probabilities. But what's the difference between a probability and a possibility? Well, according to Sartre, probabilities are indifferent objective likelihoods. For instance, a coin has an equal chance of landing on heads or tails. On the other hand, possibility involves freedom and subjectivity in which I select one potential outcome from innumerable others. And rather than just being a moment in time, being for others is a permanent and intrinsic condition, not a historical or surmountable situation, but a fundamental dimension of existence unveiled through emotions. I mentioned shame, but also fear and pride. It's this revelation through emotions that anchors the experience at the level of immediate consciousness. And remember, Sartre is trying to maintain the concrete experience of the other and myself in this, rather than rendering it abstract. This encounter with another's gaze also exposes the limitations of solipsism, showing the undeniable, tangible presence of the other's freedom and consciousness, which cannot be derived from myself or reduced to mere knowledge or categories. The gaze of the other is integral to our self-experiencing and, so to speak, cannot be overlooked. Hence, even our self-perception is not purely subjective. It's shaped by how others view and define us. And this interplay between self-awareness and the other's perception of us challenges the idea of a completely self-contained identity. It suggests that our self-understanding is always deeply embedded with our interactions with others. My feeling of being observed by another person, the other, remains even after realizing that there was nobody there. This persistent awareness of the other mirrors a profound consciousness of being for others, which is not negated by a false alarm, but rather reinforced by the ongoing possibility of being seen. And Sartre's thoughts on the relationship between being for others and being for itself suggest that being for others is not an ontological structure or essential necessity that's derived from being for itself, but a factual aspect of human existence, being on par with it. For being for others and being for itself are concurrent aspects of being, not derivatives of one another. And he further explains that the relationship between self and other is characterized by an internal negation, not an external one. Internal negation is a process of negating something in a way that constitutes the one who is doing the negating, while external negation is simply an objective differentiation of two objects unaffected by the negation. And we talked a lot about this in the previous video. Therefore, the self's identity is fundamentally defined by not being the other. This is an active process where the self continuously reaffirms its non-identity with the other to maintain its own distinctiveness, a process that Sartre refers to as a perpetual resurrection. Consequently, the existence of the other is necessary for the self to define itself. But it's here that a dialectical tension arises, as the apprehension of the subject as other cannot take place without oneself becoming objectified for the other. And conversely, I cannot negate my being this object that I perceive myself as for the other without also negating the other's subjectivity. And all this holds true for the other as well. Consequently, we have here a double and mutual negation that leads to a cyclical vacillation between self becoming object, then negating the other to become subject, and other becoming object and then negating the subjectivity of their other, me, to become a subject themselves. And this cycle highlights the inherent instability in the self's perception of the other, with neither mode of being, object or subject, fully graspable or stable. And this vacillation happens because in first being objectified before the gaze of the other, I realize this diminishment through shame, which initiates a flight from the gaze of the other in order to regain a sense of control and individuation by then objectifying the other, effectively diminishing the impact of the other's gaze, much in the way as the ring in The Lord of the Rings, or Gaiji's ring that Levinas talks about, allows one to see without being seen. Pride, like shame, is an emotional response that illustrates the relationship between self and other. But while shame prompts a retreat from objectification, pride involves acknowledging and accepting one's objectified state. It's a kind of resignation to one's objectification, all in an effort to shape how others perceive us. However, pride is inherently unstable and in bad faith, as it seeks to influence a free subject, the other, thereby reducing them to an object while demanding recognition of one's objectness, which requires the other to be a subject. This attempt to approach the other as an object to be manipulated so as to treat me as an object produces a contradiction that is ultimately self-defeating, leaving one further alienated from oneself. This exploration serves as a gateway for Sartre to enter into consideration of the essential mode through which such objectivity manifests itself. This mode is none other than the body. The intricate relationship between our subjectivity and our body, as well as the subjectivity and body of the other, will be the central focus of Sartre's next chapter, and thus the next video. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and if you want to support this work, liking and sharing this video helps. Giving a thanks through the super thanks option below is helpful, and if you want to be an ongoing supporter over on Patreon, I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritized questions and comments here on YouTube. And I want to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. And so, until next time, be well.